He returned to his hometown. After 40 years, what he found left him in tears. He stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Something about the handwriting made his hands tremble. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Thomas Jenkins had lived in the same small apartment in Chicago for 23 years. The walls were yellowed with time, the furniture old but familiar. He had his routine: morning coffee at the corner diner, a walk in the park, and quiet evenings spent reading or watching reruns of old westerns. Life had slowed down, but it was steady, predictable, safe. He hadn't expected to receive a letter. No one wrote letters anymore. That's what startled him first. The handwriting was careful, a little shaky, like someone trying to make sure it was still legible. It had his name on it. Just his name. No return address. He opened it with a butter knife. Inside, there was a folded sheet of cream-colored paper, thicker than most. At the top it said, Braymore Town Council. His heart did something strange when he read that. Braymore. He hadn't said that name aloud in 4 decades. The letter was short, a formal invitation. The town was celebrating its 150th anniversary, a list of events, a handwritten note at the bottom. We hope to see you again, Thomas. He read it twice, then a third time. He set it down on the table and just sat there. The letter lay open beside his cup of coffee. Steam rose around the edges. His fingers twitched slightly, like they remembered something before his brain could catch up. He hadn't been back since he was 18. 40 years was a long time. He got up, walked to the window, and looked out at the street below. The trees were in bloom. A kid skated past on the sidewalk. Somewhere down the block, someone was laughing. But all he could hear were footsteps on gravel, a slamming screen door, and his father's voice yelling across a field. He thought he'd buried all that. When he left Braymore, he told himself he was never going back. There had been too much pain. His parents had died in a car crash just 6 months apart. His older brother David had blamed him. They had one fight, one terrible final argument. After that, they never spoke again. And then there was Emily. He winced at the thought of her. Everything about Braymore felt heavy. But here it was, reaching out to him, like a hand through time. He sat back down and picked up the letter again. He touched the ink with his thumb, almost to make sure it was real. There was something gentle in the way the note was written. Someone remembered him, or wanted him to be remembered. He didn't sleep that night. The letter stayed on the kitchen table, lit by the weak glow of the hallway lamp. Every few hours he'd walk past it and glance at it again. By morning, he was drinking his coffee black and staring at the bus schedule. The idea of returning scared him. What if no one remembered? What if the house was gone? What if David was still angry? If he was even still alive? What if Emily... No. He stopped himself there. He closed his eyes and pressed the letter to his chest. It was just paper, just ink, but it felt like something had cracked open inside him. Around noon, he picked up the phone and called the town hall. A woman answered. "Hi," he said, his voice hoarse. "My name's Thomas Jenkins. I got a letter about the anniversary celebration." There was a pause. Then her voice warmed. "Mr. Jenkins, we were hoping you'd come." He didn't know what to say. "Your name's still on the tree out behind the school," she added softly. "You carved it there when you were a kid. It's faded, but we see it every year." He felt the breath leave his lungs. "I'll come," he said. After he hung up, he sat in silence for a while. Then he started packing. Thomas stood in the middle of his apartment, suitcase open on the bed, and wondered why the simple act of choosing socks felt so overwhelming. Every item he packed carried weight. Not physical weight, but something older. Something rooted in memories he thought were long gone. He hadn't told anyone he was leaving. There wasn't really anyone to tell. No close friends, no family nearby. Just the woman at the diner who always gave him an extra slice of toast, and the building manager who called him Mr. J out of habit. That was fine by him. Quiet was what Thomas knew best. He had built a life around it. But quiet hadn't always been his life. When he was a boy in Braymore, he had been loud. He'd laughed with his mouth wide open, shouted across ball fields, and argued with his brother about everything from chores to music. Their fights were stupid, sometimes over who got the bigger slice of pie. But no matter how loud they got, they always made up by nightfall. Back then, anger didn't last long. Until it did. Thomas was 17 when his mother died. It was sudden. An aneurysm, the doctor said. 1 minute she was at the stove cooking stew, the next she was gone. Just like that. He remembered sitting in the hallway outside the hospital room, staring at the pattern on the floor tiles and trying not to cry. His father died 6 months later. A car accident on a rainy road. The truck had flipped. No one saw it happen. Thomas remembered the sheriff's voice on the phone, slow and apologetic. He remembered dropping the phone and throwing up in the sink. After that, it was just him and David. They tried to hold it together, but grief makes people strange. It changes the way you speak, the way you breathe, even the way you look at someone you love. David started drinking. Not all the time, just enough to stay numb. Thomas buried himself in school and odd jobs, pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't. The final fight came one evening over something ridiculous. Who would pay the property tax? David was angry, red-faced, pacing the kitchen floor. Thomas had just gotten off a double shift and was too tired to argue. But he did anyway. Words were thrown like knives. Old wounds reopened. Accusations that didn't even make sense. Then David said something Thomas never forgot. "You couldn't even keep them alive. What makes you think you can handle anything?" It silenced the room. Thomas didn't respond. He didn't cry. He just walked out. Packed a bag, got on the first bus out of town, and never looked back. That was 40 years ago. He hadn't spoken to David since. He hadn't called, hadn't written. He didn't even know if his brother was alive. Now, standing over this suitcase, Thomas felt a pressure in his chest that had nothing to do with the clothes he was folding. It was the weight of unfinished conversations, of never saying sorry, of wondering what might have happened if he had stayed. He opened the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a small, folded photo. It was the only one he still had from those years. It showed him and David standing in front of their house, arms around each other's shoulders, both wearing the same ridiculous cowboy hat. They couldn't have been older than 10 and 12. Thomas stared at it. Then, carefully, he slipped the photo into the inside pocket of his jacket. Maybe nothing would come of this trip. Maybe everyone he knew was gone. Maybe the town had forgotten him completely. But he needed to see it. He needed to look at the streets that built him, to stand where his parents once stood, and maybe, just maybe, find out who he used to be. He zipped up the suitcase and took one last look around his apartment. It was time to go home. The bus was late, which somehow felt fitting. Thomas stood at the edge of the platform, suitcase in one hand, ticket in the other. He checked his watch, then checked the bus schedule again. It hadn't changed in an hour, but reading it gave his eyes something to do. Something other than scanning the crowd for familiar faces he knew weren't there. The last time he had waited for a bus, he was 18 and running away. Now he was 62 and going back. The difference between those two men felt larger than the years between them. When the bus finally pulled in, brakes hissing against the pavement, he waited for the others to board first. There weren't many. An older couple in matching raincoats, a teenager with headphones and a skateboard, a young mother carrying a baby too tired to cry. Thomas climbed the steps slowly, nodding at the driver, then made his way to a window seat near the back. As the engine rumbled to life and the station fell behind them, he leaned his head against the glass and watched the city dissolve. At first, the view was familiar. Streets lined with cafes, laundromats, and bus stops he'd passed 1,000 times. But soon the buildings thinned out. The skyline dropped. Fields began to stretch along the edges of the road, tall grass bowing in the wind like it remembered him. He folded his hands in his lap, tried to keep them still. Halfway through the ride, the bus stopped at a roadside diner. They were given 20 minutes. Thomas stepped off, his knees stiff, and walked inside. The air smelled like burnt coffee and scrambled eggs. He sat at the counter and ordered a tea, not because he wanted one, but because it gave him something to hold. An old song played on the jukebox, something from the 70s. He couldn't remember the name, but he knew the melody. It made him think of summer nights on the back porch, when his mother would hum while folding laundry, and the fireflies blinked just beyond the railing. He closed his eyes for a moment. Someone behind him laughed loudly, and the spell broke. He paid for the tea and climbed back onto the bus before anyone else. As they drove, he noticed the trees changing. They were taller here, older, the kind of trees that had survived storms and winters and decades of forgotten names carved into their bark. He wondered if the oak tree behind the school was still there, the one he and David used to climb until their mother called them in for supper. He wondered if anyone had cut it down, or if it still stood, holding their childhood in its branches. The thought made his chest ache. At one point, a little boy on the bus turned around in his seat and stared at Thomas without blinking. He had wide, curious eyes and a chocolate smudge on his chin. "Are you a grandpa?" the boy asked. Thomas blinked. "No," he said, then paused. "But I suppose I look like one." The boy nodded like that was a good enough answer and turned back around. Thomas smiled, just a little. As they neared Braymore, he felt something shift. Not fear, exactly. Not excitement either. Just a deep, quiet stirring, like waking up after a long sleep and trying to remember the shape of a dream. The bus pulled off the highway and onto a smaller road lined with telephone poles and cornfields. Thomas leaned closer to the window. The fields looked just as he remembered, flat, golden, endless. He could almost see himself running through them, barefoot and wild, the sun burning his shoulders. When the sign appeared, "Welcome to Braymore, Est, 1875, his breath caught. The bus slowed. The town waited. And Thomas Jenkins, after 40 years away, was finally coming home. The bus came to a slow stop at the small town depot, and for a moment, Thomas didn't move. He sat with his hands resting on the top of his suitcase, staring out the window like the town might disappear if he blinked too fast. It hadn't. He stood, shoulders tight, and stepped off the bus into a world that felt both painfully familiar and eerily changed. The platform was almost empty. A teenage girl with purple headphones brushed past him, dragging a pink suitcase behind her. Somewhere across the street, a dog barked. The air smelled of cut grass and old wood, just like it used to in late July. Thomas took a few cautious steps forward. The depot building still stood, though the paint was peeling worse than he remembered. A cracked bench leaned awkwardly under the window, and a faded schedule was pinned to the corkboard inside. He looked down the street. Braymore's main road stretched out ahead of him, lined with short storefronts and crooked street lamps. Some of the buildings hadn't changed. The diner with the checkered awning was still on the corner. He remembered sitting at the counter with David, splitting a slice of lemon meringue pie because their mom said one dessert was enough for 2 boys. But the movie theater across from it, the one with the red neon sign and 20-cent matinees, was gone. In its place stood a modern-looking pharmacy with a digital display and automatic doors. He walked slowly, pulling his suitcase behind him, taking in every detail. The hardware store had new windows, but the name above it hadn't changed. Harlan and Sons. He wondered if old Mr. Harlan was still alive. Probably not. But someone had kept the sign, and that meant something. He passed by what used to be the post office. It was a coffee shop now. Brew and Parcel, the sign said. Young people with laptops sat at the tables outside, sipping drinks in paper cups. Thomas stared for a moment. In his time, the only thing you could get at the post office was stamps and the occasional lecture about proper parcel weight. Further down, he saw the church. White-painted wood, tall, narrow windows. It looked exactly the same. The steeple reached up into the cloudless sky, stubborn and steady, as if it hadn't noticed the passing of time. He crossed the street, the wheels of his suitcase clicking unevenly against the sidewalk. As he passed the park, he paused. The old fountain in the center was still running. The benches had been replaced, but the stone path remained. He remembered sitting on that fountain edge with Emily one night during the summer after junior year. Her hair had smelled like lilacs. She had told him she wanted to leave Braymore, to see something bigger. He had said he did too. Neither of them expected only one of them would actually go. He looked away. Farther ahead, he spotted the old general store, now shuttered and quiet. A for lease sign hung in the window. He walked past it, heart heavy. He used to buy penny candy there, gum that lost its flavor after 2 minutes. Baseball cards, a slingshot he later regretted. The town felt smaller now, or maybe he had grown too large for it. Not in size, but in experience, in years, in the quiet things that age does to a man. He rounded the corner and paused. Willow Lane. It stretched ahead of him like a road through memory. Trees lined both sides. The sidewalk was cracked in the same places. And halfway down, just past the bend, was the house. His house. It had been painted a soft blue. The porch swing was gone. The front steps had been redone. A bicycle leaned against the railing. Wind chimes moved gently in the breeze. He stood there a long time, just looking. He wasn't ready to knock. Not yet. But he was here. After all these years, he was finally standing where his life had started, and where, maybe, it had broken. Thomas tightened his grip on the suitcase handle. He started walking again. The house on Willow Lane looked different, but the bones were the same. Thomas stood at the edge of the walkway, his eyes fixed on the place that had once been his whole world. The color was new, a soft blue with white trim. The front door had a decorative wreath on it, something his mother would have liked. There were flower boxes beneath the windows now, bright marigolds and snapdragons leaning into the sunlight. The porch swing was gone, replaced by a pair of white chairs and a small table. But the roofline was the same. The way the shadows fell across the front steps was the same. And the oak tree in the yard, older, wider, a little cracked at the trunk, still stood. He took a slow breath and started up the walkway. Gravel crunched underfoot. As he reached the porch steps, he hesitated. His hand hovered near the railing, as if touching it would break something delicate. Before he could knock, The door opened. A woman in her 50s stood in the doorway, a dish towel in one hand. Her hair was silver blonde, pulled back in a bun, and her eyes were sharp but kind. "Can I help you?" she asked, a bit cautious but polite. Thomas cleared his throat. "I'm sorry to bother you. I used to live here. A long time ago." She tilted her head slightly, curious now. "My name's Thomas Jenkins. My family owned this house. We lived here until—" He paused. "Until the early 80s. Her face softened. "Oh, you're that Thomas." She stepped aside. "Come in." He blinked. "Are you sure?" She smiled. "I've heard a lot about your family. Come on, you should see it." He stepped inside slowly, almost afraid his feet would remember too much. The air smelled of lemon polish and something baking. The floors had been redone, but he recognized the layout instantly. To the left, the living room, where his father used to sit in his recliner, pretending to read the paper, but always dozing off before page 2. Straight ahead, the kitchen. The walls were a different color now, a soft cream, but the shape was exactly as he remembered. The woman gestured to the table. "Have a seat. I just pulled cookies out of the oven. Thought my granddaughter would be here by now, but she's always late." Thomas smiled faintly and sat down. She poured 2 glasses of lemonade and set a plate of cookies between them. "I'm Margaret," she said. "My husband and I bought this house back in '96. We raised our kids here. When I heard your name on the town mailing list for the anniversary, I wondered if you'd stop by." He picked up a cookie but didn't eat it. His eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in every detail. "That corner," he said, pointing. "That used to be the phone nook. My mom had this long cord that stretched into the hallway so she could talk in private. Not that she ever said anything private." Margaret chuckled. "And right there," he nodded toward the wall, "my brother and I used to measure our heights. Pencil marks. My dad would mark them every few months." She stood and opened a small cabinet by the fridge. Inside, a thin wooden panel leaned against the back wall. "I saved this during the remodel," she said gently. "Figured it meant something." He stood slowly and crossed the room. The panel had faint lines etched into the wood. Names, initials, dates. One near the top read, "Thomas, age 11. Taller than David now." He reached out and touched it, his hand trembling. "I thought it'd be gone," he whispered. Margaret gave him a quiet moment, then said, "Some things deserve to stay." He looked at her. "I lost them all here. My parents, my brother, everything." Her voice was soft. "And yet, you came back." He nodded slowly. "I had to." And for the first time in a very long while, Thomas Jenkins let the tears come. The town square buzzed with the kind of quiet excitement that only small towns could pull off. Nothing loud or flashy, just a steady hum of familiar voices, slow laughter, and music floating from a crackling speaker near the gazebo. Folding chairs had been arranged in uneven rows. Kids ran barefoot through the grass, and someone had brought pies. Dozens of them, arranged neatly on a long folding table under a canopy that sagged slightly in the middle. Thomas stood near the edge of it all, hands in his pockets, unsure of where to go or who to talk to. He had made it this far, back to Braymore, back to the very heart of it. But standing here, surrounded by so many strangers who somehow all felt familiar, he realized something strange. He felt like a guest at his own history. A woman walked past with a tray of lemonade. Another passed by pushing a stroller. Then someone tapped his shoulder. He turned. The man in front of him was stockier than he remembered, with white hair and a sun-worn face, but there was no mistaking him. Tommy? The man asked. Thomas blinked. Mark? Mark laughed, a wide, full laugh that hadn't changed a bit. I'll be damned. They embraced, clumsily, but tightly. For a second, it felt like they were teenagers again, sneaking sodas into the movie theater and daring each other to jump off the train trestle. You look exactly the same, Mark lied. You look like someone's granddad, Thomas replied, grinning. Mark put a hand on his shoulder. I heard you were coming. Never thought you'd actually show. I almost didn't, Thomas admitted. Didn't know if anyone would remember me. Mark gave him a look that was part amusement, part disbelief. Are you kidding? You and your brother practically ran this town. Everybody remembers the Jenkins boys. Thomas's smile faltered. Mark saw it. I'm sorry. I didn't mean... No, it's all right, Thomas said, voice low. It's good to hear his name out loud again. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the celebration moving around them. Come on, Mark said finally. Let me show you something. They walked across the square toward the school. It was freshly painted, windows shining in the late afternoon sun. Behind it, the oak tree still stood, taller now, its branches thick and sprawling. Still there, Mark said, nodding. You carved your initials into it, remember? Thomas walked up to the trunk, running his hand across the bark. The carving was faded, half covered by new growth, but he could still see the letters. TJ plus DJ, a crooked heart drawn between them. He swallowed hard. We did that the summer before everything changed. I remember, Mark said quietly. They walked back toward the square. A band had started playing now, an old folk tune that made Thomas think of backyards and fireflies. As they passed the fountain, Mark nudged him gently and nodded ahead. She's here, he said. Thomas followed his gaze. Emily stood near the pie table, laughing with someone he didn't recognize. She wore a light sundress and her hair, still the same deep chestnut brown, was pulled back in a loose braid. She looked older, of course, but not old. Her face had softened, not in a way that dulled her beauty, but in the way time shapes someone into exactly who they're meant to be. She turned and saw him. Her laughter stopped. For a second, neither of them moved. Then she smiled. He walked toward her slowly. Hello, Emily, he said. She blinked once, then laughed softly, shaking her head. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. I didn't think I'd ever come back. There was silence. Then she said, You look the same. That's what Mark said. He's a liar, too. She laughed again. And just like that, the weight of 4 decades lifted, if only slightly. You want some pie? She asked. He nodded. If you'll pick it. I never was good at choosing. She handed him a plate, and for the first time in 40 years, Thomas Jenkins stood under the summer sun, in the middle of his hometown, beside the girl he never stopped thinking about, feeling, maybe for the first time, like he belonged again. The cemetery sat just outside the edge of town, past the last gas station and beyond a winding gravel road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The gate creaked when Thomas pushed it open, its metal frame cooled by morning shade. A bird fluttered from a nearby tree, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything he had carried so far. He held a small bouquet in his left hand, daisies, the kind his mother used to keep in a chipped vase on the kitchen windowsill. His right hand rested inside his jacket pocket, fingers brushing the folded photo he'd brought with him since the beginning. Graves lined the hill in uneven rows, markers aged and lopsided, names worn smooth in places. He moved slowly, reading each stone as he passed. Some names rang distant bells, neighbors, old teachers, a former shopkeeper he vaguely remembered, but he wasn't looking for them. He found his parents first. They were side by side under a tall pine tree, just as he remembered. The headstones were simple, modest, their names etched with quiet grace. Charles Jenkins, 1938 to 1981. Margaret Jenkins, 1941 to 1980. His father had lived 6 months longer, though Thomas remembered it feeling like years. He knelt, setting the flowers down gently between them. For a long time he didn't speak. He just let the silence hang there, let the wind pass through the trees and settle over the stones like a blanket. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he said finally. His voice cracked more than he expected. He told them about his apartment, about the quiet life he'd built. He told them he'd seen the house, walked the streets, that the oak tree still stood behind the school. He didn't know if they could hear him or if it mattered, but the words came anyway, hesitant at first, then steady. When he finished, he stood, brushed off his knees, and turned to leave. That's when he saw it. Just 2 rows over, a small gray marker with a name that stopped him cold. David M. Jenkins, 1960 to 2003. Thomas stared, unmoving. It didn't feel real. The years between them, of silence, of never writing, of assuming there would always be time, collapsed in an instant. His brother had died more than 20 years ago, and he hadn't even known. He walked over, legs numb, and dropped to his knees before the stone. There was no photo, no long inscription, just his name, the dates, and a single line below. He was stubborn, but he loved hard. Thomas let out a broken breath. "I didn't know," he whispered. "David, I didn't know." He stayed there for a long time, one hand resting on the top edge of the marker, like it might somehow let him feel the warmth of a person long gone. Guilt settled deep in his chest, not sharp, but dull and unrelenting. "I thought we'd have time. I thought I'd come back one day and we'd talk. Argue, probably. Maybe laugh. I thought I'd have the chance to say I was sorry." He wiped his eyes, roughly, like it might stop the tears from coming. "I was so damn proud. So were you. And we let it ruin everything." A breeze moved through the cemetery again, and he closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw them as boys, barefoot, racing down Willow Lane, daring each other to touch the neighbor's fence, and running back before the dog barked. He saw their mother calling from the porch, his father mowing the lawn. He saw it all, bright and intact, untouched by the years that followed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photo. The 2 of them, smiling in front of the oak tree. He placed it at the base of the headstone, securing it with a small stone so it wouldn't blow away. As he stood to leave, he didn't feel closure, not really. But he felt something shift, a weight, maybe, or a silence finally broken. He turned back once more before walking away. "I missed you, David," he said quietly. Then he walked down the gravel path, the morning sun warming his back, and left his brother's name behind him, but not forgotten. The sun sat lower in the sky now, casting long amber streaks across the sidewalks and rooftops of Braymore. Thomas walked slowly through town, not in any particular direction, just letting his feet carry him. His visit to the cemetery still sat heavy in his chest, but he wasn't ready to return to the quiet of his rented room. Not yet. The town felt warmer than it had earlier in the week, not just in temperature, but in spirit. It had begun to open itself to him. Familiar faces emerged from behind time-worn wrinkles and grayer hair. People smiled at him as he passed, some with polite curiosity, others with the kind of warmth that only came from remembering someone who once mattered. He stopped near the old school playground and leaned against the fence, watching a group of kids run across the field. One of them, a boy maybe 10 or 11, darted past the swings and shouted something about pirates. Another chased after him with a stick held high like a sword. Thomas smiled. It hadn't changed much. The blacktop was newer. The swings had plastic seats now. But the energy, the chaos, the laughter, it was the same. He used to be one of those kids. So had David. They'd played baseball here, scraped knees, swapped lunches under the jungle gym. "Are you Thomas Jenkins?" a small voice asked behind him. He turned to see a girl standing near the fence, maybe 7 or 8, with big round glasses and 2 messy braids. She was holding a crumpled notebook and staring at him with cautious wonder. "I am," he said, curious. "How do you know that?" The girl's eyes lit up. "We learned about you in school." He raised an eyebrow. "Me?" She nodded eagerly. "You and your brother built the treehouse behind the school. Miss Carter told us. She said it used to be the best hideout in town." Thomas blinked. He hadn't thought about that treehouse in years. They built it one summer out of leftover wood, a dozen bent nails, and too much ambition. It wasn't safe, not really, but it had stood long enough to become something of a legend. "Does it still exist?" he asked. "Sort of," the girl said. "It's mostly just a platform now, but we still call it the Jenkins Fort. It's in the big oak past the field. Want me to show you?" He hesitated, then smiled. "Lead the way." She opened the gate and marched ahead like she'd just been given a mission. Thomas followed, amused and touched by how seriously she took the role of guide. They passed the swings, the tetherball pole, and reached the far edge of the field, where an enormous oak tree stood, half hidden by tall grass and thyme. There it was. The structure had faded with the years. One side sagged, and the rope ladder was gone, but the outline remained. Wooden planks nailed into the trunk. A few boards still holding together. It was a ghost of a childhood dream, but it was still standing. "I come here sometimes," the girl said, almost shyly. "It's quiet up there." He looked at her, and something swelled in his chest. The idea that a piece of his childhood, something built with his own hands, still had a place in this town, still meant something to someone, brought an unexpected warmth. "I'm glad it's still here," he said. She looked up at him. "Were you sad when you left?" He thought about that for a moment. "Yes, but I didn't know it at the time." "Are you sad now?" He crouched slightly to meet her eyes. "Not right now." She seemed satisfied with that answer. As she ran back to join her friends, Thomas sat down on a nearby bench and looked at the old treehouse one more time. The town had remembered, not in big, flashy ways, not with plaques or headlines, but in laughter echoing through the field, in initials carved into old wood, in the stories passed down from teachers to children, in the quiet corners of memory where childhood never quite disappears. And for the first time in years, Thomas Jenkins felt something like peace. The bus rolled gently down the narrow road leading out of Braymore, its windows catching the soft gold of the late afternoon sun. Thomas sat near the back, just as he had on the way in, only now his suitcase rested a little lighter beside him, not because it held fewer things, but because he carried less weight inside himself. He watched the town drift away through the window, its streets, houses, and trees growing smaller with each turn of the road. Willow Lane disappeared behind a row of tall maples. The diner's checkered awning flickered out of sight. Even the oak tree behind the school, barely visible from this distance, looked like just another shadow among many. But he didn't feel the same as when he'd arrived. He wasn't leaving with regrets. In his lap rested a small envelope, sealed and worn at the corners. Inside was the photograph he had left at David's grave, the one of them as boys, standing in front of the oak tree, all sunburn and crooked grins. When he'd returned to the cemetery that morning to say goodbye, he found it placed neatly back on the stone, weighted by a smooth river rock and a handwritten note on lined paper. It simply read, "He kept it in his drawer for years. He said you'd come back someday." No signature, no explanation, just that one quiet truth. Thomas hadn't cried then, not because he wasn't moved, he was, but because something else had settled inside him. A stillness. Not closure, maybe, but acceptance. A thread pulled gently back into place. As the bus moved forward, he thought about the faces he'd seen during the visit. Mark's rough laugh, Emily's soft smile, the little girl at the school who treated him like a legend, and Margaret, who'd let him walk through the rooms where his life had begun and folded him into the memory of her home without hesitation. He hadn't expected kindness. He hadn't expected anyone to remember. But they had, in ways that mattered. He glanced around the bus. A young couple sat 2 rows up, their heads resting together in quiet sleep. Across the aisle, an elderly man read a newspaper with shaking hands. Life moved on. It always did. But somehow, knowing that a part of him had stayed behind, carved into a tree, remembered in a story, preserved in the echo of laughter, made that easier to accept. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook. It was old, its cover frayed at the corners. David had given it to him on his 16th birthday. He'd written a message on the inside cover. Write something real, something that matters. Thomas smiled, thumb brushing the words. He turned to a fresh page and began writing, not to anyone in particular, but just to remember. He wrote about the kitchen light at dusk, about the treehouse behind the school, about Emily's voice, still as steady as it had been in his memory, about the sound of his brother's name spoken by someone else, without bitterness, about what it felt like to stand in the middle of the town you ran from and finally stop running. The wheels hummed beneath them. The sun dipped lower. As the last signs of Braymore slipped away behind him, Thomas didn't feel like he was leaving something behind. He felt like he'd picked something up along the way. Something small, but lasting. He closed the notebook and rested his hand on it. For the first time in 40 years, he was going home, not to a place, but to himself. And this time, he wasn't alone. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.